The city of London in 1889 was the beating heart of an empire, a place of immense wealth and staggering progress. But underneath the veneer of Victorian morality lay a hunger that no amount of tea and crumpets could satisfy. While Queen Victoria sat in her palace, the streets of the East End were being purged of their most vulnerable citizens, and for years the world believed they simply vanished into the fog of history. Dr. John Watson's private records, however, tell a story so grotesque that it was struck from every official biography of Sherlock Holmes, a case known only in the deepest shadows as the Golden Fork Affair. It began on a Tuesday morning when a man named Lord Cecil Rothwell arrived at 221B Baker Street, a man whose family tree was as old as England itself, but whose eyes held the frantic look of a cornered animal. Rothwell claimed his younger brother had disappeared after joining an elite underground culinary society, but as he spoke, Holmes noticed something that made his blood run cold: the faint metallic scent of human decay clinging to the Lord's silk lapels, and a strange rhythmic twitch in his jaw that suggested a hunger that wasn't quite natural. Holmes accepted the case not to find the brother, but to confirm a horrifying suspicion that had been growing since the discovery of polished human femur bones in the London sewers 3 months prior. The investigation led Holmes and Watson into the Pit, the most dangerous slum in London, where they discovered not a killer but a supply chain. They found child-sized cages hidden in the basements of legitimate bakeries and ledgers that listed the weight and tenderness of human subjects as if they were livestock. The trail eventually led to a massive, secluded mansion owned by Rothwell, where the Gourmet Club met in total secrecy to indulge in the ultimate taboo, the consumption of the lower classes. Holmes infiltrated the mansion disguised as a French chef, witnessing a gala where the most powerful men in the country, judges, bishops, and members of parliament, sat around a mahogany table to eat dishes prepared from the very people they were supposed to protect. The horror wasn't just in the act, but in the philosophy. These men believed that by literally consuming the poor, they were absorbing their life force and maintaining the purity of the ruling class. When the main course was revealed to be the remains of Rothwell's own brother, who had been sacrificed to pay off a gambling debt, Holmes realized that the legal system he served was a hollow shell, as the very men who wrote the laws were the ones holding the carving knives. Watson, watching from the shadows, prepared to storm the room with his service revolver, but Holmes stopped him, realizing that a single arrest would be silenced by the Crown within hours. Instead, Holmes orchestrated a silent retribution, replacing the final course's seasoning with a slow-acting, agonizing toxin derived from diseased cattle, ensuring that every member of the club would suffer a death as lingering and painful as the lives they had extinguished. In the days that followed, a mysterious plague swept through the upper echelons of London society, claiming the lives of dozens of elites, while the official records attributed the deaths to tainted oysters. Lord Rothwell was found in his study, having gone mad from the toxin, attempting to eat the leather of his own books before his heart finally gave out. Watson burned the evidence of the case, realizing that the truth would trigger a revolution that would burn London to the ground. But he could never look at a fine dining establishment again without smelling the copper tang of blood. The case of the Baker Street cannibal remains the only time Sherlock Holmes acted as judge, jury, and executioner, deciding that some monsters are too high-born for a rope and too hungry for a cell. Today, the mansion stands as a luxury apartment complex, but residents still report a faint smell of roasting meat coming from the walls and the sound of silver cutlery clinking in empty rooms. The story of the Golden Fork is a reminder that the greatest predators don't live in the woods. They live in mansions, they wear tailored suits, and they are always, always hungry for more. This is the truth that the history books were too afraid to tell. The moment Sherlock Holmes looked into the heart of the British Empire and found nothing but a gaping, bloody mouth. If you ever find yourself in a place of extreme wealth and notice the guests looking at you with a bit too much interest, Remember the name Rothwell and walk away, because some hungers can never be satisfied, and some secrets are buried for a reason. The horror of the Gourmet Club did not end with the deaths of its members, because Sherlock Holmes soon realized he had only severed one head of a hydra that spanned the entire globe. As Watson watched Holmes meticulously clean his surgical tools in the weeks following the Rothwell massacre, he noticed a terrifying change in his friend's demeanor as the detective began to map out the connections between the London cannibals and similar culinary circles in Paris, St. Petersburg, and New York.
Holmes became obsessed with the idea that the global elite were not just criminals, but a separate subspecies that had lost all empathy for the human race, viewing the general population as nothing more than a renewable resource for their perverted appetites. The journal entries from this period are frantic, describing how Holmes began to experiment on himself with small doses of the same toxins he used on the lords, trying to understand if the hunger was a biological infection or a spiritual rot. He spent nights wandering the morgues of London, not looking for clues, but looking for the marks of the fork on unclaimed bodies, realizing that the Gourmet Club was merely a franchise of a much larger organization he called the Harvesters. Watson describes a night when they followed a black, unmarked carriage to the docks of Limehouse, where they saw crates labeled as prime beef being loaded onto a ship destined for the Americas, only for a crate to break open and reveal the frozen, salted remains of a missing family from Whitechapel. Instead of calling the police, Holmes stood in the shadows and whispered that the law was a leash designed to keep the dogs from biting the masters, and that he would no longer play the part of the loyal hound. He began to operate entirely in the gray, using his network of Baker Street irregulars as a spy ring to sabotage the shipments. But for every crate he destroyed, 10 more reached their destination. The psychological toll on Watson reached a breaking point when he found Holmes in the lab at 221B, staring at a piece of human tissue under a microscope with a look of terrifying curiosity, wondering aloud if the refined meat of a philosopher would taste different from that of a laborer. This was the moment the partnership truly fractured, as Watson realized that in fighting monsters, Holmes had allowed his cold logic to strip away his own humanity until he saw the world exactly as the cannibals did, as a series of chemical reactions and biological matter. The final straw came when a high-ranking government official visited Baker Street, not to arrest them, but to offer Holmes a seat at a new table, promising him knowledge beyond the limits of mortal morality if he would help them optimize the harvesting process. Holmes didn't refuse with a moral lecture, he simply asked for the guest list, and when the official left, Holmes turned to Watson and said that the only way to stop a fire is to burn the entire forest. He began a campaign of systematic arson and assassination that the newspapers called the anarchist riots of 1890, but it was actually a private war between one man and the world's most powerful predators. Watson's last entry about the cannibal case is a warning to future generations that the meat is still on the table and that the institutions we trust to protect us are often the ones providing the seasoning. He died believing that Holmes had failed, but the truth is even darker. Holmes didn't fail to stop them. He simply realized that the hunger was a fundamental part of the human hierarchy and chose to become the thing that hunts the hunters. The video ends with a shot of a modern-day high-end gala where the camera zooms in on a golden fork held by a faceless billionaire, and as the screen fades to black, the sound of Holmes' violin plays a discordant, screeching note that sounds like a human scream.
The obsession with the harvesters transformed 221B Baker Street from a residence into a war room where the wallpaper was covered in anatomical charts and the global shipping routes of human flesh. Watson recorded that Holmes stopped eating traditional food entirely for 3 weeks, subsisting on a chemical sludge of his own making, claiming that his palate had to be cleansed to perceive the biological signature of the elite predators. The detective began to track the Black Banquet, a rotating event that moved between the shadows of the Vatican and the private islands of the Caribbean, where the world's leaders traded political favors for the chance to consume the organs of child prodigies and fallen revolutionaries. Holmes discovered that the true purpose of the ritual wasn't just physical consumption, but a form of psychological dominance, a way for the powerful to bind themselves together through the shared guilt of an unforgivable sin, creating a global conspiracy of silence that no court could ever touch. One evening, a package arrived at their door containing a human heart preserved in a jar of expensive cognac, with a note that simply said, "A gift for the observer," prompting Holmes to realize that the harvesters were no longer hiding from him, but were actively inviting him to join their ranks as their chief procurer. The horror deepened when Holmes traced the source of the club's finest vintage to a secret wing of a London orphanage that was being funded by a prominent charitable foundation, revealing that the very institutions of Victorian mercy were functioning as feedlots for the wealthy. Watson describes the sight of Holmes standing over the furnace at Baker Street, burning a stack of photographs that proved the identity of the harvester's supreme leader, a man whose face was on every British coin and whose name was spoken only in whispers of reverence. The realization that the rot went to the very crown of the empire broke the last of Holmes's restraint, leading him to plan the Great Purge, a series of orchestrated laboratory explosions across London designed to destroy the club's refrigeration facilities and poison their stockpiles. During the chaos of the 1891 Great Fog, Holmes engaged in a final confrontation at a riverside warehouse in Rotherhithe, where he faced the club's master butcher, a man who claimed that he was merely a servant of nature's true law, where the strong survive on the marrow of the weak. Holmes didn't argue the morality of the act, but instead demonstrated the physical reality of his own theory by injecting the butcher with a neurotoxin that mimicked the sensation of being cooked alive while leaving the mind perfectly conscious. Watson's journal ends with the terrifying observation that after the warehouse burned to the ground, Holmes returned to Baker Street and spent hours staring at his own reflection, practicing a smile that looked less like a man and more like a wolf. The doctor's final chilling realization was that Holmes hadn't destroyed the hunger, he had simply cleared the competition so that he could watch the world starve from a position of absolute intellectual superiority. The manuscript concludes with a blurry sketch of a golden fork crossed with a magnifying glass, a new heraldry for a world where the line between the detective and the monster had finally, irrevocably vanished. As the ink fades on the final page, Watson leaves us with the thought that we are all just cattle waiting for the next genius to get hungry, and that the fog of London never truly lifted. It just moved inside our souls. The legend of the hero of Baker Street is a lie told to children so they can sleep, while the real Sherlock Holmes remains in the shadows, still calculating the caloric value of the human spirit and waiting for the dinner bell to ring one last time. The final descent into the abyss of the Baker Street cannibal began when Holmes realized that the physical consumption of flesh was merely the gateway to a more profound and metaphysical parasitism. Watson's notes become almost illegible as he describes the final supper prepared by Holmes in the winter of 1891, an event where no guests were invited, yet plates were set for 12 invisible entities representing the pillars of British civilization. Holmes had spent months synthesizing a compound he called the essence of mourning, a liquid distilled from the adrenal glands of those who had lost everything to the harvesters, believing that by consuming the chemical markers of human suffering, he could achieve a state of pure, detached omniscience. He forced Watson to witness the extraction process in the 221B laboratory, where a captured member of the elite was subjected to a series of psychological terrors while his blood was siphoned into a silver basin, Holmes explaining with a terrifying calm that the flavor of fear was the only truth left in a world of lies. The detective's transformation was complete when he began to refer to the population of London not as citizens, but as the herd of the unrefined, openly mocking Watson's medical ethics as the delusions of a man who still believed he was more than meat. During the final days before the Reichenbach event, Holmes had constructed a map of the world made entirely of dried human skin, pinned with needles to mark the locations of every processing plant, from the opium dens of China to the meatpacking districts of Chicago. He revealed to a trembling Watson that Moriarty was never a criminal mastermind, but the harvester's chief logistical officer, a man responsible for the waste management of the global feast, and that their upcoming duel was not a battle of good versus evil, but a corporate takeover. Holmes intended to seize control of the entire distribution network, not to stop the killing, but to regulate it with the cold efficiency of a machine, ensuring that not a single ounce of human potential was wasted in the gullets of the unworthy. Watson describes the chilling silence of their final journey to Switzerland, noting that Holmes looked at every passenger on the train with a predatory gaze, mentally calculating the marbling of their muscle and the clarity of their fluids. The struggle at the Reichenbach Falls was, according to the secret journal, a staged ritual where Holmes and Moriarty merged their interests, with Holmes faking his death to operate entirely from the shadows as the grand architect of the harvest. When Holmes returned years later, his skin had a translucent, waxy quality, and he no longer required sleep or sustenance, having perfected the art of energetic extraction performed on his clients during consultations. Watson realized that every time Holmes solved a case, he was actually selecting a new victim for the upper-tier banquets, using his reputation as a hero to lure the most spiritually rich individuals into his orbit. The Doctor's final entry is a plea for the reader to destroy any record of Holmes' existence, for the mere act of remembering him provides the mental bridge he needs to feed on the consciousness of the living. "The great detective is not dead," Watson wrote with a bleeding hand. "He is simply waiting for the next course, and as you read these words, you have already been served." The journal ends with a single sharp drop of black ink that looks like a puncture wound, leaving the terrifying implication that the reader is the final ingredient in a century-long recipe for total human subjugation. The final revelation of the Baker Street cannibal was not found in a blood-soaked kitchen, but in the cold silence of the 221B archives, where Watson discovered the subscription list. It was a ledger containing the names of every prominent family in Europe, each paying a monthly tithe to Holmes to ensure they were served only the purest specimens of humanity. Holmes had stopped being a detective and had become the world's most elite sommelier of suffering. He explained to Watson that the human race was reaching its peak and that the only way to preserve the genius of the species was for the elite to literally consume the biological data of the exceptional. The Reichenbach Falls was not a battle, but a baptism, where Holmes shed the last of his moral constraints to become the silent god of the global harvest. When Watson finally confronted him with a loaded revolver, Holmes didn't flinch. He simply smiled and pointed out that the very bullets in Watson's gun were manufactured in a factory owned by the harvesters. "You are part of the machine, John. You have eaten at my table for 10 years. You are what you have consumed." Watson realized with a crushing horror that the stew Holmes had prepared for him during his many illnesses was the reason for his own unnaturally long life and sharpened senses. He was no longer a doctor, he was a refined product of the very system he loathed. The journal's final page is a map of the modern world, showing how the harvesters' network evolved into the global corporations and data streams of the 21st century. Holmes' last words to Watson before the doctor's disappearance were a promise. In 100 years, they won't even need the meat. They will feast on the data, the memories, and the very souls of the masses through screens of glass and light. I am merely the pioneer of the new hunger. The manuscript ends abruptly with a sketch of a human eye inside a golden pyramid, the ink still wet as if it were written seconds ago. Watson's final act was to bury this warning, knowing that by the time it was found, the harvest would be total and the world would belong to the man who lived at 221B. The detective's pipe wasn't filled with tobacco, but with the dried essence of 1,000 broken lives, and as the smoke rose, so did the new empire of the hungry. There is no escape from the great game, because the game is played with our lives as the stakes and our bodies as the prize. Sherlock Holmes is not a hero of the past, he is the architect of our appetite-driven future. The case is closed, but the table is still being set for you.